Hi there, and welcome to Master of Horror, where I give you the scariest paranormal stories that I've ever come by.
Paranormal story number 1, The Trailer.
So these two experiences happened within a month of each other. The first one happened to my brother-in-law. The second one I witnessed firsthand. Back in 2007, my sister and her husband used to live with me and my mother. I was in middle school at the time. One Saturday night, my brother-in-law was working at his security job, and my sister and I were with my mom at a church function. These church functions would last until about 8 or 8:30, so we wouldn't get home until around 9 o'clock at night. We pulled up to the mobile home. Usually my brother-in-law would be inside waiting for us, but instead he was outside standing by himself, looking like he had just seen a ghost. As we pull into the carport, I noticed that all the lights are off inside. When we get out of the car, he lifts his hand and points at the house and says, in a shaken voice, "I'm not going in there by myself." We asked him what happened, and this is what he told us. "I came home and I was walking into the carport and was about to enter the house. I heard what sounded like a group of people talking and laughing inside the house. I heard silverware and dishes clinking, like there was some sort of dinner party, but all the lights were off. I thought you guys were trying to play a prank on me or something. So I got up the steps and I pulled out my house key. The whole time I still hear muffled chatter and laughing and even music. As soon as I put the house key into the doorknob lock, I heard someone go, 'Shh,' and then the entire house went silent, like everything just stopped at once. As soon as I opened the door, I hear a stampede of people running in the opposite direction. At this point, I'm starting to think that it wasn't a prank and someone or some people had just broken into the house and were trying to leave before they got caught. So I ran around the back of the house to cut them off. But once I got there, everything went quiet. I thought that maybe whoever was inside didn't run out because they knew I was on the other side of the house now. So I sprinted back to the front door and I opened it and ran inside. It was quiet and pitch black. I turned on all the lights and cleared the entire house. Not one thing was out of place. Nothing to indicate at all that anyone was there. That's when I ran outside and waited for you guys to get here." The second occurrence happened a month later in the same house. My mom was out doing something, I don't remember what, and my sister and her husband were on a date. Halo 3 had just come out, and my brother-in-law kept his Xbox in his room. Before he left that night, I begged him to play the game while he was gone, and he reluctantly agreed, so I had the whole house all to myself. I turned on all the lights in the house for obvious reasons, but since I wanted the full effect of the video game, I turned off the light in my brother-in-law's room. So the light, and the only light, was coming from the TV. As I'm playing, I feel like someone's walking around in the trailer. When living in a mobile home, you can literally feel every movement. So I paused the game and I waited to hear something. But a few moments of silence, that's when I decided to say something. "Hello?" No response. So I got back to playing the game, brushing off the noise. A few moments later, I see a shadow from under the door out of the corner of my eye. I paused the game and looked directly at the door, and the shadow moves out of sight. At first I think someone had come home early, so I call out again, but I get no response. Now I'm getting a little freaked out and sitting in the dark room trying to hear any noises in the house. But all of a sudden, I hear the refrigerator door open all the way. Then it slammed closed, but the kitchen light was now off. In fact, all the lights on the left side of the trailer were off. Now I was starting to panic, thinking that there's a burglar or something in the house. So I quietly walked to the living room, keeping my eye on the dining room area. And then I turned on the TV in the living room. I turned up the volume as loud as I can. I then turned to the kitchen light, which slightly illuminates the dining room, and jumped into the middle of the room, yelling, hoping that I would frighten anyone or any trespassers. However, no one was there. I then run through the entire house as fast as I could, bashing doors and yelling as I do, so no one other than me was inside the house, and all the doors and windows were closed and locked. If someone had opened the fridge, they wouldn't have had enough time to get past the door to go outside without me seeing. I go back into my brother-in-law's room, locked the door, and blast the TV as loud as I could, and played Halo 3 until my mom got home. I know that our landlord's parents had both died inside of that house of old age, and they died in the kitchen and the dining room, the same spots where most of this paranormal activity has been taking place. Before this, I didn't really believe in paranormal activity or ghosts or demons or any sort of entities, but the power of experience is very persuading. After my grandma passed away in 2010, my father and I took some time off of work and school to help make the funeral arrangements. 2 days went by since the funeral, and we were now back in our hometown, hundreds of miles away. None of us knew at the time, but this would not be the last time we would hear from Grandma. Fast forward to a few months later, in mid-August. I'm 19 years old at the time. My parents decided to spend the day at the local fair, so I'm home by myself. It's a nice sunny day outside, but I'm in my bedroom with the curtains drawn and playing music, being your typical late 90s rebellious teenager. My room had it all: a TV set, an air conditioner, a 5-disc stereo, and one of those new DVD players along with the PlayStation, and of course, a phone. It was one of those old-fashioned rotary models. It had one of those famous distinctive ringtones that sometimes you can hear in the older movies. It was sometime after lunch when the music was interrupted by the sound of the telephone ringing. There was something not quite right about the ringtone. It was noticeably slower. I answered the phone. Yeah, I expected it to be my parents asking me to go grab them from the local fair, but all I heard was a sound of static on the other side. Again, I say, "Hello?" Over the static, I heard my actual grandmother's voice reply, "Hello? Grandma, is that you?" There was no reply, only static. Then the line went dead. I hung up the receiver and just stood there, looking at the phone. I'm a little freaked out at this point, so I put the music back on and I try to put the pieces of the last 10 seconds together. The strange ringtone, the static, Grandma's voice. Was someone trying to pull an elaborate prank on me? I try to push my thoughts to one side. An hour later, the phone rings again. This time, however, there was no drawn-out ringtone, nor was there any static. When I put the receiver to my ear, the voice was indeed one of my parents, asking me to pick them up from the local fair. This confirmed to me that the phone call I received earlier was definitely something out of the ordinary. I didn't tell anyone about that bizarre phone call for years. I thought it was just best to keep this experience to myself forever. But sometimes things don't always go as planned. 10 years go by and the year is 2019. By this time, my parents had moved to the same area that my grandmother used to live. I traveled to go see them for a weekend, and I'm chilling out in the lounge area watching TV when my mother asked me, "Has Travis told you about Granny's ghost?" No. What's that about? She then relays a story to me about a freaking encounter involving my brother Travis and our deceased grandmother. His experience happened 4 years after mine in 2013. My brother lives in a pretty small house. I've always felt a strange energy about his place. His house was built from scratch around the millennium, so I know that it's not haunted, and it has no kind of history or significance to it. This is what happened. Travis was home alone one night sleeping in his bed when something caused him to wake up. Although it was dark, he saw a ghostly, slightly transparent figure wearing a blue dress standing at the foot of his bed. He looks at the apparition and notices the face of our grandmother. The figure then spoke to him. "There's someone in the lounge," Travis replied. "Okay, Grandma, I'll go check it out." The apparition then vanished. My brother gets out of his bed and walks the short distance to the lounge area. There's nobody there. Then he goes back to his bedroom and falls asleep as if nothing ever happened. How he managed to keep his composure and not get freaked out, I do not understand. During this experience, I have no idea he saw the ghost of our grandmother wearing her favorite dress and heard her voice. I would have flipped out big time. Listening to that story resulted in me confessing to my mother about the phone call I received 10 years prior. I thought she would be sad or even a little upset that I kept it to myself for so long. Instead, she was excited and actually smiled, and she wanted to know every little detail. My brother and I have not seen the ghost of my grandmother since we have concluded that the strange phone call was potentially our grandmother looking for closure. I have read stories about telephone circuitry being manipulated for the deceased and ghosts actually calling their relatives just days after they died. But we still not have figured out the meaning behind Travis's encounter.
The entities on the roof.
12 years ago, when I was 20, I had been married for 2 years and had 2 kids. I was a stay-at-home mom and my husband worked as a landscaper. We lived in a double-wide trailer. One night, I was at home alone because the kids were visiting their grandparents, and I decided to relax and watch a movie. Our home was about a mile away from the nearest neighbor's house. It rested atop a large hill that was surrounded by dense forest. I had barely started the movie when I heard what sounded like a kitten meowing outside. I got up and decided to investigate. I went outside and immediately noticed something wasn't right. The meowing sounded like it was coming from about 20 feet up in a large oak tree. When I walked over and stood directly underneath the branches, the meowing turned into a deep growling, not like a dog, but someone pretending to be a dog. It was too dark out to see anything clearly. I was beginning to get scared, and that's when I decided to go back inside and lock the door. While I contemplated whether or not I would be overreacting by calling the police, that's when I heard a loud boom on my roof, followed by the most insane, high-pitched scream I had ever heard. I covered my eyes and ran to the bedroom and grabbed the shotgun. I was shaking with fear because I knew something or someone was trying to scare me, and this whole ordeal wasn't normal. You could just feel that it was something different. I called my husband at work, and just as he answered, the noises started again, only deeper and longer. He told me to hang up and call the police, but I knew they wouldn't be out there for at least another hour or two. So instead, I decided to stand facing the window with the shotgun. After a few moments, what looked like a dark shadow-like entity jumped down in front of the window facing me. It had complete red glowing eyes. After staring at me for a few seconds, it then growled. I was in disbelief at what I was looking at, and just then, I heard another sound on top of the roof. And just like the first one, another dark entity jumped down off the roof, staring right at me. It was standing right next to the first entity. Instinctively, I cocked back the hammer on the shotgun. I didn't want to shoot through the window if I could help it, but I wasn't going to let them get into my house. It looked like they pressed their faces to the window, and all I could think about was how silent it was, and all of a sudden how pulling the trigger would break the silence. I'm not sure how long we locked eyes, but I suddenly noticed a pair of headlights coming up the driveway. I recognized my husband's car. I wanted to scream out for him not to get out of the car, but before I could even open my mouth, both black entities jumped back onto the roof and into the darkness. My husband never caught a glimpse of them, and ultimately didn't believe me, but his mother did and confided in me that she had seen them before. She believed that they were some kind of demon-like entity. Over the next few years, before we moved away, I would occasionally hear meowing from the trees and around my house at night, but I would never go out to investigate, not after what happened the last time. I'm not sure what they were, but paranormal or not, I don't ever want to find out what they wanted from me.
The Woman in White.
When I was 7, we lived in a very old and completely empty house without furniture or even bathrooms. If you had to go to the restroom, you needed to leave the house, and you'd had to go outside and use the outhouse. An outhouse was a restroom that was outside, and they used to make those back in the day. This outhouse had a very heavy rusty door that never wanted to open easily. One night I was sleeping upstairs, but I heard something in the kitchen beneath me. Assuming it was my parents, I went downstairs thinking they might share a snack with me, but to my surprise, there was no one there and nobody had passed me to go back upstairs. Since I was already downstairs, I decided to go outside to the bathroom. For some reason, I wasn't afraid, given the circumstances. I opened the squeaky door and did my business, and shoved the heavy door back open again, intending to head back to bed. I looked up at the house and noticed, through the window on the ground floor, a woman in white. And when the outhouse door slammed shut behind me, she turned and made eye contact with me. I stood dead frozen, staring dumbfounded back at her. Suddenly, terrified that I had no idea who this woman was, I closed my eyes and waited for a moment, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. I sprinted back into the house, the long way, just to avoid the room that she had been standing in. I ran upstairs and huddled terrified in my room until I fell asleep again. I never told anyone what I saw. Now fast forward to when I was 10 years old and living in another house. I shared a bedroom with my two brothers, and my sister slept in the room across the hall. I woke up around 2 o'clock in the morning because I heard the sound of footsteps across the hall, walking over to the glass panel door on my sister's side. I saw a small girl who I assumed to be my sister. She was dressed in all white and pressing herself against the panel from inside my sister's room, and she was staring right back at me. I opened my door and asked her if everything was all right, but being able to see her much clearly now, that there was only one panel of glass between us, I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that it definitely wasn't my sister. The girl didn't answer as she stared back at me with eyes that seemed entirely too wide and dark. I slammed my door shut and leapt back into my bed. It took me hours before I fell back to sleep. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. The last incident was last year. When I was 17 years old, I was playing football for my high school at the time. I was sleeping in my own room and was awoken by a muttering sound from outside my door. I thought it was my mother, but what really disturbed me was that the voice was chanting something extremely rapid in another language that definitely wasn't English. And my mother doesn't speak any other languages other than English. Part of me really wanted to get back up and open the door, but I felt a chill. Then the voice completely stopped and I found myself unable to move. I don't know how long I was paralyzed, but it was not until the sun began to rise that I felt I was able to move again on my own. I have no idea if it's the same entity that's been haunting me. If anyone knows or has any suggestions, please let me know.
The Haunted Apartment.
Hi, I used to live in a townhouse in Rosenberg, Texas, in the mid-1990s. We had an older man named Johnny who was the maintenance man, and he had a friend named Ted that would help him do the maintenance work for the townhouses. So when people would move out, Johnny and Ted would have to clean up the apartment, fix it up, and get it ready for the new occupants. Johnny would tell me that people would leave the most outrageous things behind. He claims that most people never even cleaned up the place when they left, leaving most of their valuables behind. Well, one day, Johnny the maintenance man told me that something horrible happened to him the night before. He had spent the night in one of the apartments that he was cleaning out, and he claims that he was alone in the apartment around 1 o'clock in the morning, and instead of driving back home, he decided to spend the night since there was so much work to be done. Ted, his friend that usually helps him, didn't come that night to help Johnny. So Johnny was all alone and the electricity was off. But Johnny the maintenance man had his flashlight, and he said that he had some candles with him, and he had made a small sleeping area on the carpet floor and laid down to sleep to try to get some rest before he had to wake up in a few hours to start work again. He claims in the middle of the night he was awoken by someone calling his name in the room. No one was in the room at the time. He thought it was his imagination and went back to sleep. But then he woke up again about an hour later, feeling sharp pain coming from beneath his feet. He moved the blanket from his feet and he saw that he had red marks under his feet, as if someone was scratching his feet. He said it was really painful, and he got up and walked around the room to brush it off. He then heard a noise coming from the closet. That's when he opened the closet door, and to his surprise, there was a Ouija board on the top shelf. Whoever lived there cleaned out the whole apartment, but left the Ouija board behind. He got chills all over his body when he saw it, and quickly threw the board in the trash outside the apartment. He went back to sleep, and then was awoken a third time, feeling pain coming from his feet again, as if someone was punching the bottom of his heels. He jumped up and quickly opened the closet door to see if the board was still there, and to his surprise, even after throwing the Ouija board away, the board was in the same original spot it was in, on the closet top shelf. He got his keys as fast as he could, claiming that it felt as if he was being watched. The whole time his flashlight wasn't working anymore for some reason, and he couldn't find his candles. He had to find his way in the dark out of the apartment. And he claims while he was going down the stairs in the dark, he heard something right behind him following him down the stairs. While he was driving away, he said he saw a cloaked black figure looking out the bedroom window that he was sleeping in. He said he never went back to that apartment, and he's always stayed away from Ouija boards.
Emmanuel, the ghost.
So after a whole decade of bearing this story inside of me, I finally decided to say it. I know other people would like to hear this story, but I also need to hear someone else's take on it and get a different perspective of what had happened. So here goes. In the late fall of 2009, I was driving my friends home after a night of beer and bowling. I was a designated driver, and I was super sober. We were driving down the back roads to avoid road work on the highways and driving through small residential areas that had lots of open patches of farmland. Less than a mile from the first stop, where I would be dropping off one of my friends, I spotted something on the side of the road. I applied the brakes and slowed down. In the pitch darkness was a kid, a young boy just wandering down the road all by himself. He looked about 8 or 9 years old. I pulled off the side of the road and quickly got out of the car and walked over to him. When he saw me coming, he just nervously stared at me like a kitten would that's in a cage at a pet store. It was evident that he had been crying. I told him my name and asked him if he was all right, and why he was out here, and where he was going at this time at night. He was wearing a red shirt that was 2 sizes too big for him, green shorts and flip-flops. It was probably very cold though. He was doing a great job of not showing it. After a while of hesitating, he said his name was Emmanuel, and he had run away from home, and he had gotten lost and couldn't find his way back. He spoke in a kind of scary low whisper, like he was worried about what he should say. I pulled out my cell phone and asked him for his parents' number so I could call them, and he claimed he couldn't remember it. Then my drunk friends that were in the car started screaming for me to hurry up and get back in the car. My buddy that was in the front seat got out of the car to take a piss in the weeds. So I told Emmanuel to jump in the passenger seat, and I told my drunk friend who got out of the car to climb in the back with the other guys. I closed the passenger door and walked over to the driver's seat, but I did not tell Emmanuel to put his seatbelt on because I didn't want to scare him or make him think that we're trying to abduct him. I just wanted him to remain calm. I started up the car and we started driving. All my intoxicated drunk friends were all awkwardly introducing themselves from the back seat, but Emmanuel just stared ahead at the dashboard and ignored them. I noticed after a few moments Emmanuel started crying again. I couldn't tell if they were tears of pain or fear. I just said, "Are you all right, man?" He nodded and let out a tiny hiccup. I told him that there were some fast food napkins under the seat, and he reached down and used one to wipe his tears. I considered calling the cops, but one of my drunken friends was underage, and you know how that goes. The police would be more interested in him than the kid. He said his house was another 10 minutes from here. I had to drop off 2 of my friends, and the last friend fell asleep in the back seat. I finally left the residential streets and got back on the main road. I drove for a few minutes before finding the street. I asked the kid how long he had been walking, and he replied, "A very long time." I was kicking myself for not offering the kid any food or water. I didn't have any in the car, but I could have definitely stopped somewhere. I finally pulled into the cul-de-sac and drove to the very last house. It was kind of tucked away behind some trees. I pulled into the driveway, but before I could even park the car, the kid opened the door and hopped out and said, "Thanks." I remember thinking that his voice sounded so much more cheerful and calm than it had been before. He ran towards the house, where there was absolutely no lights on, and he waved to me once he got to the front porch. I leaned over to pull the passenger door shut, and was surprised to find the handle was icy cold to the touch. Not so cold that it was unpleasant, but cold enough to catch my attention. When I looked back up, Emmanuel was gone, and I hadn't heard the door shut. No lights came on inside the house either. I waited for another 5 minutes, but my friend's snort in the back reminded me I needed to get him home. After I dropped off my last friend, I parked my car and decided to call the police, just to do a welfare check on the kid. I gave the operator the address. She informed me that no one lived there. I told her what had happened and asked her to please have a cop go over there to check on the kid. It was already past 2 in the morning. When I pulled into the driveway, 2 cop cars were already there, waiting for me. They said they had swept the entire property and checked inside the house, but there was no one. I finally contacted a private investigator friend of mine, and she informed me that several years prior to the place being abandoned, another family had lived there in the house who had lost a son in a freak accident. He had been killed while riding his bike on the side of the road, and it was the same exact spot I had found Emmanuel walking. She told me his name was Charlie, but his middle name started with an E. I felt like I had swallowed wet cement because my insides were all heavy. To this day, I refused to believe that I encountered anything paranormal. The boy on the side of the road looked solid with real flesh and bone. How could he even be a ghost? I drove by the same spot where I found him just to get a look at the place during daylight. After waiting in my car for a few moments, I drove off. I hadn't made it 15 feet when I caught a glimpse of a boy in a red polo shirt in my rearview mirror. I slammed on the brakes and I jumped from the car to look around, but there was nothing there. There are so many nights that I have stared up at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if that boy was really a lost soul. Upon returning home, he was unable to find his family. For those of you who believe or not in these things, what do you think? What can I do to be able to sleep peacefully at night?
The church entity.
My name is Lana, and I'm finally ready to talk about what happened to me in the summer of 2019. I had just turned 16 that November, and I was ecstatic. I could finally get my driver's license, and that was my first step to freedom. After my birthday had passed, the summer finally came around. In the summer, there were plenty of camps I could have attended. The one that I finally set my mind on was called United Methodist Camp. Basically, what you would do was you went for a week Sunday through Saturday, and during that time, you worked all day building things, usually wheelchair ramps for the elderly or disabled. It was generally a fun experience until Wednesday rolled around, the day we started the unusual waking up at 6 a.m. At 11, all the teams, including mine, would head out and start on the wheelchair ramps. We usually were able to finish a ramp in about 2 days. So Wednesday was my team's second day working on this particular ramp. We finished up at around 3 in the afternoon. So my counselors and the rest of my team headed back to the church that we were staying at. I should probably clarify the living situation. The boys stayed in a separate building, and the girls stayed in the basement of the church. I'm not sure about the boys' rooms, but the girls were put into a room down in the basement that was originally used as a Sunday school classroom. There were 2 pictures hanging on the wall of Mary and a picture of Jesus. That Wednesday night, we all laid down to go to sleep. There was a girl named Sydney who was laying down across the room, and she started saying things like, "We should tell scary stories." We all asked her to go to sleep. Sydney proceeded to knock on the wall behind her, saying, "What if we get a knock back from the other side of the wall?" After about 5 minutes, the room was dead silent. We all figured that Sydney had passed out, so one by one, we all drifted off to sleep. I was laying on the opposite side of the room from Sydney, and I was facing the pictures of Mary and Jesus. After everyone had fallen asleep, I was still awake, just laying there in silence. Finally, my eyes became very heavy, and I laid my head down on the blow-up mattress. Suddenly, I heard this tiny knock coming from the wall behind us. The knock was quiet enough for only me to hear, but just loud enough to wake me out of my tired state. I then looked at the pictures that faced me on the other side of the room. I then sat up in bed in a state of terror. What I saw will forever haunt me to this day. I saw a tall, faceless figure leaning down, staring at me. The thing was so tall it had to bend its extremely skinny neck to look at me with its featureless face. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't move or scream. The figure started to bend its neck down towards me. What felt like an eternity of laying there watching this freakish thing move closer to me. A light flashed in the room from someone's phone and it snapped me out of my trance. I jumped to my feet and dove into the bed of one of my friends. I stayed there with her for the rest of the night with my head under the covers. I cried until I finally passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up that morning, I acted like everything was normal. I was terrified about what I saw, but if I said anything to anyone, they would have thought that I was going nuts, so I kept it to myself. My counselor kept asking me if it was okay. She told me later on that she caught me staring off into space and silently crying throughout the day, which I have no memory of. I really wish this was the end of the story, but to my dismay, it is not. When night came, the girls had gotten into a fight about something, and this resulted in their moving into different rooms. My best friend Milani and myself were the only ones left in the room with the pictures. I was absolutely terrified to go to sleep in the room again, since it was just me and only one other person. As we were settling down for the night, my youth director, Rose, who was a close friend of ours, walked into our room and talked to us for a while. Suddenly, we heard an ear-piercing scream echo through the basement. It came from one of the other rooms the girls had moved into. The three of us rushed into the hallway to see what was happening. The girls ran out of the room and were absolutely hysterical. One of them grabbed me and said, "He's here, the devil's here." I then made my way into the room that the girls had just fled, and I felt a dark presence lurking there. When I looked to the corner of the room, I could see the same dark figure that I had saw the night before. I then turned around and left the room as quickly as I could. One of the girls were finally able to tell us that something had grabbed one of them and a moaning sound could be heard in the room. I'm not sure if the girls actually saw something, but I put two and two together and concluded that there was something evil residing within that church. And that night it showed itself to me for some unknown reason.
The Horned Creature.
Hi, I was born in 1983. Every summer I would visit my aunt's farm in South Wales. I was out in the countryside that had many acres of land with fields, forests, and streams. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, I had already spent a couple of summers there, and I knew the land quite well. I would spend 4 to 6 weeks there at a time. Because I was comfortable around the grounds, I never felt worried about exploring on my own. I would be hanging around the hay bales in the barn, or riding my mountain bike around the fields, or just generally looking around to see what I could find. But one day, it was musky and foggy outside, and also eerily silent. I was in the grassy fields next to the farmhouse. I wasn't doing anything exciting. To be honest, I can't even remember what I was doing there. Suddenly, I started hearing my name being called as clear as day. Michael, Michael, Mike. I looked around and I couldn't see anyone. Another nephew of my aunt, whose name was Nick, also lived on the farm. He's older than me, and he would always enjoy playing tricks on me whenever he got the chance. I thought it was him. I heard the voice calling out to me again. It was actually said in a manner that didn't sound panicked or menacing, but just trying to get my attention. I looked around and noticed, off in the distance, there was a horse stall, and I could see a person inside of it calling to me and waving their arms above their head, as you would expect when someone is trying to get your attention. "Nick, what are you doing in there?" I shouted as I started to walk towards the stall. I thought it must have been him, but from where I was standing, it didn't really look like him. It was really weird because whoever it was appeared to have horns on top of their head that curved backwards. I was quite far though, so I thought that Nick might have had a stupid hat on or something. I continued to walk closer, and as I did, the figure in the stalls seemed to fade. When I got there to the stall, it was completely empty. There was only one way a person could have gotten out, and that was directly in front of me. Not only that the horse stall was in the middle of a large field and there was nowhere they could hide, but someone had definitely been there calling out to me and waving. They had a pair of horns on their head, and I definitely saw them fading as I approached. I ran straight back to the farmhouse and found Nick and my aunt and uncle sitting at the kitchen table. I asked Nick if he had been outside calling to me, and he laughed and said, "I've been here for hours, mate." Both my aunt and uncle confirmed this. To this day, I have no explanation as to who or what that thing in the horse stall was, but it's a memory I'll never, ever forget.
The cabin entity.
On January of 2014, my former best friend Samantha invited me and 6 others to come stay at a rental cabin for her birthday. The cabin had 2 stories with 6 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms with a jacuzzi on the outside porch, so we had plenty of space. After pizza and cake, we all went outside to hang out and make talk for a while. So after about 1 hour goes by, we all go back inside. However, this time, upon entering the cabin, it felt different. Everything in my body was telling me not to be there, and I started to feel sick. There was a sinister presence lurking in our midst, circling us like vultures. I tried my best to ignore it, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. Everything was fine until the lights in the upstairs hallway suddenly went out. We were all in a group, and none of us were physically close enough to the light switch to flip it. I noticed that my friend Alyssa was acting strange ever since we got back inside. She must have also felt the same dreadful presence that I did. Alyssa ended up calling her mother to come pick her up early. I never talked to her about why exactly she left that night, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Alyssa's departure sort of broke the party's momentum, and everybody began to feel very uncomfortable. One by one, the other guests started to leave until it was only me, Samantha, and our mutual friend Chloe. While we were there alone, loud scratching sounds and random thuds began to echo throughout the old cabin. We went downstairs to see if maybe Samantha's father was messing with us, but no one was there. We decided to brush off the strange occurrences. It wasn't until about 3 a.m. we decided to head back upstairs and try to get some sleep. When we got to the top of the steps, we froze with absolute terror. A dark, thin black figure stood at the end of the hallway, and then, just as fast as it appeared, it disappeared into thin air right in front of us. We all screamed at the top of our lungs and ran into the bedroom, locking the door behind us. For some inexplicable reason, we still didn't take the hint and get the hell out of there. We grabbed some pillows and blankets and decided to sleep in the same bed, thinking that it wouldn't come for us if we were all together. Despite the unsettling feeling I had, I was still exhausted, so I ended up dozing off. But after about 5 minutes, I woke up to hear a low, menacing growl coming from the foot of the bed. I had gotten chills from head to toe. All I could do was lay there and pray that nothing would happen to us. I kept thinking, just ignore it and it will go away. I kept coaching myself to go back to sleep, but 10 minutes later, I hear the loudest growl I've ever heard in my entire life. The growl was loud enough to wake up everyone. That's when we made up our minds to get the hell out of there. We suddenly smelled a putrid stench, like a mixture of rotten eggs and sulfur. At this point, we had enough, and we decided to flee the cabin and never return. To this day, I still get chills whenever I talk about that night. I'm just happy we all made it out safely.